position. The deal will not be completed. However, if both sides work toward a win-win outcome, they will seek creative ways to provide divisibility and reversibility. If principles become involved, each side should diligently work to move the negotiation away from these types of discussions and get back to the substance of particular issues. In general, negotiators seeking win-win agreements need to find divisibility in goods that appear indivisible, leave room for reversing decisions reached in earlier agreements, and should move the conflict away from principles. Another example of how to do this might help. The principal of an international architectural firm recently discussed with me a situation that he faced during a negotiation for a major project in China. The firm's client was asking that a provision be included in their contract that is never provided under a U.S. contract. Initially, the firm was extremely stubborn to permit this provision in the contract, and the Chinese were unwilling to forego this provision in the contract. Obviously, the provision was regarded as indivisible by both parties. It was treated as an all or none issue. After some investigation and questioning, the American firm realized that what their Chinese client expected to receive was very different from what the Americans had thought they were being asked to provide. Since the principal had entered the negotiation with a U.S. frame of reference, he immediately reacted in a negative manner to the request from the Chinese negotiators. However, when he shifted his thinking to consider the case from the Chinese negotiators' perspective, it made him realize that he was unwilling to give up something that would put his client at ease and cost his firm very little in the transaction. Not realizing this would have resulted in a negotiation failure. It was a deal breaker. In the end, the client was pleased that the firm was willing to give up something that was perceived as important to them, and the architectural firm was readily able to request other provisions in their favor. So before leaving this particular portion of the presentation, let me reiterate the methods to use in reducing conflict, whether it's real or perceived, during the negotiation process. Remember to keep in mind three key dimensions discussed: the divisibility of goods involved, the reversibility of the decisions made, and the extent to which principles are involved. For any of these dimensions, creating divisibility, achieving a form of reversibility, and moving the conflict away from principles will have a beneficial effect on the outcome. We should now turn our attention to the conflicts that occur as a result of cultural differences. In considering how cultural differences influence the generation of conflict in a negotiation, we'll consider the role of negotiation styles, with some highlights of differences between nationality that give rise to conflict situations and how to manage those. Then I will review the situational variables that influence the negotiation. Returning to the subject of negotiation styles, we know that these would be affected by one's personality, language, organizational culture, and national culture. Even in an international negotiation, we cannot give primary attention to cultural or language differences and ignore the personality variables and differences in organizational culture that are generating conflict. Recognize that each of these must be managed appropriately. I will place my concentration today on influence coming from the negotiator's national culture. For example, there are some interesting contrasts that can be drawn between Japanese, North American, and Latin American negotiators. The differences are numerous. I will focus your attention on three areas: the role of emotions, the nature of the decision-making process, and the role of face-saving during the process. First, the Japanese appear more dispassionate during negotiations and emote less often. They make decisions as a group and seek consensus before they proceed. The negotiations may take a prolonged period of time because the Japanese team must all be in agreement before moving forward. The process to obtain agreement, referred to as nemawashi, occurs through a series of one-on-one meetings outside of the negotiation. This process is critical to the Japanese because they would not want anything to happen that would embarrass a member of their team or the other side. Face-saving to avoid this form of embarrassment is crucial. North Americans have a very different style. They tend to be rather direct and sometimes impersonal in their style. Americans sometimes use an expression that characterizes this style. We say, "Don't take it personally." In a group situation, they may openly conflict with the other side. Face-saving is not important. Decisions tend to be reached through a thorough cost and benefit analysis, often methodically organized to facilitate their decision-making process. Latin Americans are emotionally passionate. It is not uncommon to see a wide range of emotions expressed in one meeting during a negotiation, vacillating between great humor, seriousness, and anger. To the Latin American, the negotiation process itself holds great interest and entertainment. The sparring between negotiators is a welcome part of the negotiation, and decision-making is often spontaneous and impulsive. Face-saving is crucial to Latin Americans, similar to the Japanese. However, their purpose in face-saving is to preserve one's honor and dignity. You can begin to see where conflict would surface in these style differences. In my own experience, it was rather jolting the first time that I negotiated with the president of a global Japanese electronics company and found his eyes to be closed during several portions of the meeting. I resisted the desire to ask him about this behavior, though I can often get away with these types of questions by playing more of a professorial role. Nevertheless, I decided to observe this difference in behavior and not offend the president by questioning whether he was paying attention to my conversation. As it turned out, the president discussed this difference in behavior at the conclusion of our first meeting, when we were greeting one another on a less formal basis and preparing to leave for dinner that evening. He indicated that Japanese often close their eyes or gaze away from others to concentrate on the words being spoken. So I have found that the best strategy to use in cases where you are unfamiliar with a cultural practice is to observe very carefully the nature of that practice or ritual and consider its importance in the negotiation process. Usually, we have a personal barometer that lets us know when we feel that we are being manipulated by a cultural practice common in a foreign country. If we sense that this practice is unfavorably shifting the balance in power, we seek ways to restore it. This will become especially apparent as I shift toward discussing the conflict-producing characteristics of situations that must be managed. 4 broad areas that you should consider as you enter a negotiation are the location, mine, yours, or a neutral place, physical arrangements, the shape of a table, seating position, participants, who are they? Why were they chosen to represent the other side? How does their personal style influence your capability of establishing a relationship with them? And time limits. How much time do we want to spend negotiating? How do the 2 sides of the negotiation treat time? Will the pace of the negotiating be slow or quick? First, the subject of location can stimulate conflict. Obviously, holding a negotiation in your home country offers the best advantage. In your home country, you can control the nature of social occasions during the negotiation and are completely familiar with the language, customs, and habits of your country. If all negotiations could be held in your home country, life would be simple. However, when you are the seller of goods to a foreign country, it is frequently advisable to hold the negotiation in the host country. An alternative is to meet in a neutral location, and may be a safe choice in the early exploratory stages. If this is not possible, being in the host country, while being difficult, can be a great learning experience. There are few substitutes for being in that country. Experiencing their culture, understanding the governmental and legislative barriers that will face your company. Everyone realizes that location is an advantage in the negotiation. One side to the negotiation must deal with the myriad of differences that they will face in another country. My sense is that location arouses conflict when the host country takes too much advantage of this situational variable. There should be some expressed willingness of the host country to appreciate the difficulty that the other side is under. If you take a helping and teaching role in dealing with the inevitable adjustment difficulties for the other side, the negotiation is more likely to move toward win-win. This is particularly true in cases where the people who have traveled to your country are concerned about overcoming governmental or cultural barriers. Your willingness to assist foreigners in adjusting to these differences in conducting business enhances their willingness to reach a win-win agreement. Physical arrangements are also a crucial part of the negotiation situation. It is not uncommon for both sides of a negotiation to show great concern for the shape of the table, the seating position of the participants, or the place where the negotiation will be held. If we assume a win-win posture throughout a negotiation, then the type of physical arrangement we create must be set up to stimulate cooperation and collaboration in working on the issues. This is often the way the Japanese approach a negotiation, and I have sat in rooms on many occasions where we sit on the same side of the table, facing the flip charts that we've created on the wall to collect the relevant information for the negotiation. The Japanese assume that when both parties face the problem, they are less likely to engage in hostilities between the people. So for conflict to be reduced, we should employ physical arrangements that stimulate cooperation. Don't think that these arrangements change the competitive nature of this situation. It really just alters the playing field and permits the participants to focus on solving the problem rather than conflicting over people. Participants are also one of the key considerations for negotiations. We need to take into account the status, perceived power, and decision-making authority of the persons in the negotiation. With regard to status, when possible, it is necessary to balance the status of people representing both sides of the negotiation. For example, in Latin America, the status of a negotiator is critical. You would not want to send someone of much lower status to negotiate with a person of higher status to Latin America. There are instances where that is unavoidable, but those circumstances are generally acceptable to the host country. For example, in many entrepreneurial companies, it is not possible to send someone whose status matches that of the other side to the negotiation. I am working with a Southern California-based company that is currently negotiating distribution agreements for their products in Hong Kong, Brazil, Mexico, and London. In the case of Brazil and Mexico, the principals of the company have close friendship ties to the Brazilians and Mexicans. This has helped tremendously in gaining access to people that this young company would not be able to see. The potential Brazilian and Mexican partners in this venture have been extremely helpful in arranging meetings and identifying business contacts for this company. Conflicts have been avoided by assuming a teaching and learning role. The younger principals in the American company have been mentored by the older principals of higher status in the Latin American company. Another important aspect of the decision regarding who should participate is the number of participants. Americans tend to favor fewer participants. Sometimes the individual responsible for securing a piece of business is motivated to go it alone and become the hero for sealing a particular deal. In most international negotiations, this is a mistake. Why? Because the presence of more people communicates to the other side in the negotiation that the negotiation has been ascribed to be more important to the company engaged in it. Another reason for more people is to make sure that key decision makers are present at the negotiation, so that the negotiators from the other side feel that they are talking to someone that can actually make decisions for the company. Age and gender are also important factors. With gender, women's roles in other countries might dramatically differ from your home country. In general, do not make the mistake of discounting a woman's role in another country if you are unaware of their customs. As an example, consider another case situation faced by the international architectural firm that I discussed earlier. The U.S. architecture firm, which maintains offices in Hong Kong, has been working directly with a Chinese man and woman representative on the same team with similar job titles. Even though each assumes different responsibilities, they seem to hold great resentment towards one another. Making matters worse, the American firm decided to solicit business from the Chinese woman, and she became instrumental in hiring the firm for some preliminary design work. Since the firm did not directly deal with her male colleague, the firm has found that he continually criticizes the work of the architectural firm, especially if it does not meet his expectations for deliverables. To seek a win-win outcome and retain the business of the Chinese company, the principal in charge settled on a solution that appears to be working. One firm member is attending to the Chinese woman's needs, and the other is accommodating the Chinese male's needs. It appears that when one member of the firm works with both Chinese managers, the relationship to their client is compromised by placing the man in competition against the woman for the attention of the American firm. By dividing the U.S. firm's staff and using different team members of similar status to each Chinese manager, their relationship has improved. The principal in charge has tried to maintain a neutral position on most issues and has allowed his individual project managers to represent different sides of the client's positions. We are hoping for a win-win, but the eventual outcome is still unknown. It is important to note that the American firm chose to stay away from the ideological issues raised by this conflict. To actually have addressed the lesser role of a woman in a Chinese negotiation would have certainly caused a loss of business. However, to have ignored the woman in favor of the man would have compromised the principles of the American firm. The solution chosen does not compromise the principles of the American firm and appears to be satisfying the Chinese company. Their approach suggests that when conflict surfaces between managers of opposite genders in the host country, it is important to be sensitive to this conflict, while not compromising your principles and honor each manager's need for attention and prominence in negotiations. The final area to be discussed today includes reviewing some quick suggestions for obtaining culturally synergistic solutions in a negotiation. First, remember to separate the people and their cultural differences from the issues or problems being discussed. Learn to appreciate the cultural differences and become accustomed to moderating your expectation for time of meetings, length of negotiations, and other factors. This does not necessarily imply that you need to be fully accommodating to the foreign culture. No one in another country expects you to be one of them. Indeed, no matter how much time you spend negotiating with the Japanese, you will always be a foreigner. Second, seek to focus on interests rather than positions. As a matter of fact, to promote win-win negotiation, you can come up with different positions or alternatives to satisfy interests on a mutual basis, as opposed to competing over whose position is most suitable. Third, when possible, try to locate objective criteria to judge the value of different interests. If costs can be calculated for different options, then try to do so. Fourth, be creative and seek to identify options that yield mutual gain for each side. When you locate goods that are indivisible, find ways to divide those goods. Locate reversibility in decisions by offering time periods for consideration of an approach or agreement. Permit one side or the other to reverse a decision if they perceive it not to be in their interests. In these cases, costs incurred for these expenses can be divided among the parties involved. Remember, international negotiation is most rewarding in that it establishes new business and social relationships and enhances the global reach of our businesses. Despite all of the difficulties experienced, it is a uniquely satisfying experience. Fortunately, for the executive who is willing to take the time to appreciate and understand the nature of negotiating in different cultures, such as yourselves, the rewards are well worth the effort. Best of luck in all of your future negotiations. I am now prepared to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for attending today's teleconference.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrlich. Let's begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which now appear on your screen. We remind you to make your calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. The first question is from El Instituto Tecnológico de León in the city of León in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, and we understand that El Instituto is celebrating its 25th anniversary. Felicitaciones al Instituto Tecnológico de León.
We would like to send our greetings to all of you who are attending this video conference. We are celebrating indeed our anniversary. Congratulations, Dr. Ehrlich, for your wonderful presentation. We have a question for you here. What do you think about including these techniques for conflict resolution in our study programs, in our regular curricula, in our BA programs, in our technological institutes, and other universities in Latin America in order to improve the knowledge and the skills of the people who leave our institutions having graduated with their BAs?
Well, obviously I'm biased because I think these ideas are very powerful in helping students to understand how to approach an international negotiation process. So I think the more that we impart this type of learning to students, the more they're able to comfortably enter any negotiation situation and use this framework to establish methods to make the negotiation successful and achieve win-win outcomes. Particularly because I think the framework is easy to understand. You really only have to keep the three variables in mind that I discussed during the presentation, and I found in training my own students, when they come back to me and talk about some of the negotiations they've been involved in, it becomes rather intuitive to incorporate these within their thinking.
Our next question is from KTV Comunicaciones, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Good afternoon. What would be the most important thing to do in an international negotiation in terms of cost benefits? To hire experts in negotiation, or do you think it would be more important to hire interpreters who could translate not only conversations but also in a cross-cultural situation they are experts as well? So what do you think would be more cost-effective? Hiring translators, interpreters, or hiring a negotiator?
Personally, I think it's more important to have the negotiation conducted by the people who are actually doing the business with the other side. I think that it gives an opportunity for those people to establish a relationship with one another and get to know one another. So I would prefer to use an interpreter in a negotiation rather than to have an expert present who would do all of the negotiating for me. I've been in both situations, and I think if the expert is well versed in the company, for example, in some of the companies that I consult with, I am a regular member of their staff in many cases. So I understand the business, I understand the products, I know the markets, and as an expert I can add value in that negotiation process. However, if someone really does not understand the company and does not have a strong relationship with the people that are involved, I would prefer to use an interpreter because ultimately we're establishing a human relationship between the people involved in the negotiation. And if we always are using experts and people that are not as familiar with our products and markets, then the other side has less of an opportunity to understand the people involved and establish a long-lasting relationship.
Thank you. Our next question is from El Colegio de Bachilleres, Estado de Sinaloa, in the city of Culiacán, in the state of Sinaloa, México.
Buenos días. Adelante la pregunta. Buenos días. We are indeed celebrating our 16th anniversary, and we also want to initiate our corporate network that will put us in touch with the other parts of Mexico in Sinaloa and their 5 centers, educational centers. So we are inaugurating a new network, educational network. Our question is, one of the elements that that is very important in a conflict is the degree of it has to do with the principles, and when this is manifested in a very high degree, the principles and idiosyncrasies, what do you think would be the best way to look for a win-win situation? How can you keep your principles and your culture and still go for a win-win approach?
Personally, I think that it's very difficult to compromise principles in a negotiation. So if the other side that you're negotiating with is asking you essentially to compromise those principles, I personally would walk away from that negotiation. However, the best way to reduce conflict in a negotiation process is to really move the whole conflict situation away from a discussion of principles, because principles are things that we typically do not change. Oftentimes principles are reflected within our laws, and we really cannot move away from that. However, in terms of our day-to-day conversation and our negotiations, we should try to keep our principles in mind but not bring those forward in the negotiation process on a routine basis. Also, congratulations on your 16th anniversary, and I wish you much success in the future.
Our next question is from el Instituto Universidad Empresa, la Universidad de Blas Pascal, en la provincia de Córdoba, en la Argentina.